Psalm 18. The voice of the Lord shakes the earth. Every chain holding you breaks now. Psalm 18 is not a gentle whisper meant only to comfort the soul. It is a declaration of power, a cosmic proclamation that when the Lord speaks, reality responds. This psalm reveals a God whose voice does not merely soothe, but shakes foundations, breaks chains, silences enemies, and rearranges destinies. David did not write Psalm 18 from a place of ease. He wrote it after being hunted, betrayed, cornered, and surrounded by forces that wanted his life extinguished. This is the testimony of someone who saw death close enough to feel its breath, yet lived to proclaim that the voice of the Lord is stronger than every weapon formed against him. When Psalm 18 declares that the Lord's voice shakes the earth, it is revealing a spiritual law. Nothing that binds you can remain intact when God decides to speak on your behalf. Chains, whether spiritual, emotional, mental, generational, or circumstantial, are not broken by human strength alone. They are shattered when divine authority is released. This psalm is a battle cry for those who feel trapped, delayed, oppressed, or restrained by forces they cannot overcome in their own power. There are moments in life when prayer feels heavy, when waiting becomes exhausting, and when silence seems unbearable. Yet Psalm 18 teaches us that silence is not absence. God may be silent, but when he speaks, it is never small. One word from him can undo years of suffering. One command can reverse seasons of loss. One breath of his voice can dismantle systems that were designed to hold you captive. This message is for those who sense that something is about to break, for those who feel pressure before release, for those who know deep within that the chains are still there, but they are no longer permanent. Psalm 18 is not only ancient poetry, it is living power. And today, its truth declares this: the voice of the Lord is speaking, and every chain holding you breaks now. There is a moment described in Psalm 18 that changes everything. David says that when he cried out to the Lord in his distress, God did not respond quietly. He did not send a subtle sign or a distant answer. Instead, the earth trembled and shook. The foundations of the mountains quaked. Smoke rose from God's nostrils. Fire came from his mouth. The heavens bowed, and darkness was under his feet. This is not symbolic exaggeration. This is spiritual reality expressed in human language. It reveals that when God intervenes, creation itself reacts. Chains exist because there is resistance. Every chain represents an agreement between limitation and time. It says, you cannot move past this. But Psalm 18 reveals that God does not negotiate with chains. He does not reason with oppression. He confronts it with authority. When his voice is released, the environment that supports the chain collapses. That is why the earth shakes. That is why foundations tremble. The systems that allowed bondage to exist can no longer stand. Many people assume chains are only external circumstances: poverty, sickness, opposition, or lack. But Psalm 18 shows that chains often begin internally before they manifest externally. Fear becomes a chain, trauma becomes a chain, guilt becomes a chain, unforgiveness becomes a chain, repeated disappointment becomes a chain. Over time, these internal restraints align with external resistance, creating cycles that seem impossible to escape. Yet David reveals a truth that changes everything. When you cry out to the Lord, your voice does not stop at the ceiling. It reaches the throne. David says, "In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice." This means that your cry activates movement in heaven, and when heaven moves, earth responds. The shaking is not against you, it is for you. The trembling is not destruction, it is deliverance. God shakes what is holding you so that what he placed inside you can finally rise. Chains break when divine order interrupts human limitation. That is why Psalm 18 emphasizes sound. The voice of the Lord, thunder, thunderous rumblings, hailstones and coals of fire. Sound is vibration. Vibration disrupts structure. Spiritually, the voice of God carries authority that destabilizes everything that is not aligned with His will. That is why chains cannot survive it. Some chains have existed for so long that they feel permanent. You may have prayed before and seen no immediate change. But Psalm 18 reminds us that timing is not denial. Delay is not abandonment. David was anointed king long before he sat on the throne. Between promise and fulfillment, chains tried to redefine his identity. But when God finally spoke, no enemy could stop the outcome. There is also a warning hidden in this psalm. When God's voice shakes the earth, it is not selective. Everything unstable is exposed. Everything false is revealed. Everything rooted in fear collapses. That includes relationships, habits, and mindsets that cannot survive truth. This is why deliverance can feel intense. Shaking is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. If the ground did not move, the chains would remain buried and unseen. Psalm 18 also teaches that God does not break chains from a distance. David says that the Lord reached down from on high and took hold of him. This is intimacy and power. God does not merely command your freedom. He personally intervenes. He pulls you out of deep waters. He rescues you from strong enemies. He brings you into a broad place. Chains are replaced with expansion. Restriction is replaced with space. Fear is replaced with stability. If you feel like your life has been narrow, constricted, or suffocating, Psalm 18 declares that God is bringing you into a broad place, not because you earned it, but because He delights in you. That delight is what triggers the breaking. Not your perfection, not your performance, His delight. This is why the enemy fears the moment God speaks, because when God speaks, justification ends, accusation ends, delay ends. The voice of the Lord is not just sound, it is decision. And when God decides, chains have no choice but to break. If this message is speaking to you, and you want to continue receiving teachings that strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding of Scripture, and remind you of God's power in your life, subscribe to the channel now and stay connected for more messages like this. Psalm 18 reveals another dimension of divine intervention that many people overlook: the strategic nature of God's voice. When the Lord speaks, He does not only break chains in the present moment, He dismantles the patterns that created those chains in the first place. This is why David's testimony goes beyond a single rescue. It is a revelation of transformation. God does not simply remove danger, He reorders reality around the one He delivers. David describes how God trained his hands for battle and strengthened his arms so that a bow of bronze could be bent. This is deeply significant. The breaking of chains is not only about release from captivity, it is also about preparation for what comes next. Many people desire freedom, but are not ready for responsibility. Psalm 18 shows that God's voice both frees and equips. He does not just pull you out of bondage, He rebuilds you so that you do not return to it. Chains often return when identity remains unchanged. A person can be freed externally, yet remain bound internally. This is why Psalm 18 places such strong emphasis on God's involvement after deliverance. David says that the Lord made his feet like the feet of a deer and set him secure on the heights. This imagery is powerful. A deer does not stumble easily on high places. It is agile, alert, and balanced. Spiritually, this means that God gives stability where there was once fear, confidence where there was once hesitation, and discernment where there was once confusion. The voice of the Lord reshapes perception. Before deliverance, everything feels threatening. Every sound feels like danger. Every delay feels like rejection. But after God speaks, perspective changes. David no longer sees enemies as unstoppable forces. He sees them as obstacles already defeated. This is not arrogance, it is clarity. When God speaks into your life, He does not just change circumstances. He changes how you interpret reality. One of the most profound truths in Psalm 18 is that God's voice establishes justice. David declares that the Lord rewarded him according to his righteousness and according to the cleanness of his hands. This statement has often been misunderstood. It is not a claim of sinless perfection, it is a declaration of alignment. David is saying that God defended him because his heart was aligned with God's ways, even when his life was under attack. Chains often form when injustice goes unanswered. Psalm 18 reveals that God is not indifferent to injustice. When he speaks, false narratives collapse. Many chains are sustained by lies. Lies spoken over you, lies spoken about you, and lies you have spoken to yourself. The voice of the Lord destroys lies because it carries truth that cannot be contradicted. This is why Psalm 18 describes God as a shield, a stronghold, and a fortress. These are not passive images, they represent active defense. God does not merely watch as you are attacked. He positions himself between you and what seeks to destroy you. David also speaks about pursuit. He says that he pursued his enemies and overtook them and did not turn back until they were consumed. This is not a call to personal vengeance. It is a revelation of spiritual authority. After God breaks chains, he does not leave you powerless. He restores your ability to move forward with confidence. What once chased you no longer controls your direction. Fear loses its authority. Trauma loses its grip. Shame loses its voice. The voice of the Lord also restores dignity. Chains strip dignity. They reduce identity to survival. Psalm 18 reverses this. David declares that God exalted him above his adversaries and delivered him from violent men. Exaltation here does not mean pride. It means restoration to rightful position. God lifts you back into who you were always meant to be. Chains distort purpose. God's voice realigns it. There is another crucial layer to Psalm 18. Obedience amplifies deliverance. David says, "With the merciful you show yourself merciful, with the blameless you show yourself blameless." This is not favoritism, it is resonance. God's voice resonates most powerfully where there is alignment. Obedience does not earn deliverance, but it positions you to sustain it. Chains may break instantly, but freedom must be maintained intentionally. Psalm 18 also confronts pride. David acknowledges that it was God who lit his lamp and enlightened his darkness. This humility is essential. Many people are freed, then forget who freed them. But David anchors his testimony in gratitude. Gratitude protects freedom. It keeps the heart soft and the spirit alert. It prevents the return of old chains under new disguises. The shaking described in Psalm 18 is not chaos. It is recalibration. God shakes what cannot remain so that what is eternal can stand. This applies not only to external enemies, but also to internal attachments. Some chains are familiar. They feel safe because they are known. God's voice disrupts that false safety. He replaces it with truth, even when truth feels unsettling at first. David concludes Psalm 18 by declaring that the Lord lives and that blessed be his rock. This is a declaration of permanence. Chains are temporary. God is eternal. This perspective changes everything. When you understand that the one who speaks over you is unchanging, fear loses its foundation. Anxiety loses its justification. Hopelessness loses its argument. If you are in a season where things feel like they are shaking, relationships, plans, emotions, identity, Psalm 18 invites you to see that shaking differently. It may not be destruction. It may be deliverance in motion. God often shakes before he establishes. He breaks before he builds. He removes before he restores. The voice of the Lord does not speak to maintain comfort. It speaks to establish truth. Comfort is a byproduct, not the goal. Freedom is the goal. Alignment is the goal. Purpose is the goal. Chains cannot coexist with those realities. As you reflect on this message, Understand that the same God who responded to David's cry is attentive to yours. His voice has not lost its power. His authority has not diminished. His ability to intervene has not weakened. When he speaks, chains still break. Patterns still collapse. Futures still shift. If this message is strengthening your faith and helping you see God's power more clearly in your life, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more teachings that reveal the depth, authority, and transforming power of God's Word. Psalm 18 carries a truth that becomes clearer the deeper you enter its message. When God breaks chains, He is not only responding to what is happening around you, but to what is forming within you. Deliverance is never only external. If freedom does not reach the inner structure of the soul, chains will eventually rebuild themselves in new forms. That is why Psalm 18 is so intense, so detailed, and so absolute in its language. It is not describing a surface-level rescue. It is revealing a total intervention. David speaks repeatedly about being surrounded. He was not facing a single enemy or a single moment of danger. He was encircled. This matters because many chains are not formed by one event, but by accumulation, repeated fear, repeated rejection, repeated betrayal, repeated delay. Over time, these experiences create internal walls. You stop expecting relief. You stop believing escape is possible. Survival replaces hope. Psalm 18 confronts this state directly. David says the cords of death entangled him, and the torrents of destruction overwhelmed him. This is psychological, emotional, and spiritual pressure combined. What breaks this kind of pressure is not advice, strategy, or self-improvement. It is encounter. David says that God parted the heavens and came down. This is the language of closeness. God did not remain distant. He did not delegate deliverance. He came himself. This is essential to understand. Chains that formed through prolonged suffering require personal intervention from God. And Psalm 18 reveals that God is willing to come close when His people cry out. There is something deeply transformative about realizing that God is not only powerful, but present. Many people believe God can help, but struggle to believe He will. Psalm 18 dismantles that doubt. The imagery of God riding on a cherub and flying swiftly on the wings of the wind is not meant to impress. It is meant to reassure. It tells you that God does not arrive late. He does not hesitate. He does not move reluctantly. When He responds, He moves with intention and speed. Chains often convince people that God is slow, distant, or indifferent. Psalm 18 corrects that lie. The delay you experienced was not because God was unaware. It was because timing was shaping you for what freedom would require. If deliverance came before internal alignment, it would not last. God waits not to withhold, but to prepare. Another profound truth in Psalm 18 is that God's voice clarifies identity. David does not describe himself as a victim once God intervenes. His language shifts. He speaks as someone restored to authority. This matters because chains thrive in confusion. When you no longer know who you are, you become easier to control. Fear replaces conviction. Doubt replaces direction. Psalm 18 shows that when God speaks, identity is reestablished. David says that God made him the head of nations. People he did not know served him. This is not about political power. It is about restored influence. Chains reduce influence. They shrink your voice. They isolate you. They convince you that your presence does not matter. God's voice reverses that. It restores significance. It reminds you that you were created to affect environments, not be crushed by them. Psalm 18 also exposes a difficult truth. Some chains persist because they are reinforced by misplaced trust. David contrasts how foreigners submit reluctantly while God's people respond in loyalty. This teaches that freedom is sustained by allegiance. When you trust fear more than God, chains tighten. When you trust circumstances more than truth, chains strengthen. God's voice calls your loyalty back to Him. There is also an emotional healing embedded in this psalm. David speaks of being rescued from strong enemies who were too powerful for him. This admission matters. Many people remain bound because they refuse to acknowledge vulnerability. Psalm 18 does not glorify self-sufficiency. It glorifies dependence on God. Admitting that something was too strong for you does not weaken faith, it activates it. The voice of the Lord also dismantles shame. Chains often come with internal accusations. You should have known better. You should be stronger. You should not feel this way. Psalm 18 does not echo accusation, it echoes affirmation. God delights in David. That delight is not based on perfection, but relationship. Shame loses power when delight is revealed. Another critical aspect of Psalm 18 is endurance. Deliverance is dramatic, but sustaining freedom is intentional. David describes how God equipped him, strengthened him, and trained him. This shows that freedom is not passive. After chains break, responsibility begins. God empowers you not only to stand, but to advance. He gives discernment so that you recognize future threats before they become new chains. Psalm 18 also reveals that freedom changes how you respond to conflict. Before deliverance, David was reactive. After deliverance, he is decisive. Fear no longer dictates his movement. This is a sign of true freedom. When you are free, you no longer move based on panic or survival. You move with purpose. The imagery of God lighting David's lamp is especially powerful. Darkness is not just the absence of light, it is the absence of clarity. Chains thrive in darkness because confusion keeps people trapped. God's voice brings clarity. It reveals what was hidden. It exposes what was false. It illuminates what was distorted. This is why freedom often comes with uncomfortable realizations. Light exposes, but it also heals. Psalm 18 ends with praise, not because the battle was easy, but because God was faithful. Praise is not denial of struggle, it is recognition of deliverance. David praises because he remembers where he was and where God brought him. Memory protects freedom. Forgetting invites bondage. When people forget how God delivered them, they become vulnerable to repetition. If you feel that chains have shaped your thinking, limited your vision, or altered your identity, Psalm 18 speaks directly to you. God's voice is not only capable of breaking what holds you, it is capable of restoring who you are. You are not defined by what tried to destroy you. You are defined by the one who rescued you. And if this message is helping you understand God's power, His closeness, and His purpose more deeply, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more teachings that reveal how God's Word brings real freedom, lasting transformation, and unshakable faith. Psalm 18 carries a dimension of deliverance that reaches beyond the moment of rescue and enters the realm of destiny. When God breaks chains, He is not only freeing you from what was, He is clearing the path for what must still unfold. This psalm makes it clear that bondage is never random, and neither is deliverance. Every chain that held David was connected to a future that needed protection, refinement, and preparation. God's voice did not intervene merely to stop pain, it intervened to preserve purpose. David describes how God brought him out into a broad place. This single phrase carries enormous spiritual weight. A broad place is not merely freedom from confinement, it is access, movement, vision, and possibility. Chains restrict space. They compress life. They force you to think small, dream cautiously, and move defensively. When God speaks, He does not just remove restraint, He expands your internal and external world. He restores your capacity to envision a future that is not shaped by fear. Many people underestimate how deeply chains affect perception. Long-term bondage alters expectations. You stop hoping fully because disappointment has trained you to anticipate loss. Psalm 18 confronts this internal narrowing. God brings David into a broad place because freedom must be matched with expansion. If the mind remains narrow, the soul will rebuild chains, even in open spaces. God's voice reshapes the inner landscape so that freedom can be sustained. Another powerful truth revealed in Psalm 18 is that deliverance exposes false strength. David acknowledges that God rescued him from enemies stronger than he was. This admission is essential. Chains often remain because people cling to self-reliance as identity. Psalm 18 dismantles the illusion that strength is independence. True strength is alignment with divine power. When God speaks, he strips away false confidence so that true authority can be established. David also reveals that God gave him the shield of salvation and that God's right hand supported him. This imagery shows that deliverance is not only an event, it is ongoing protection. Chains do not always return in the same form. Sometimes they return as temptation, sometimes as compromise, sometimes as distraction. God's voice does not leave you exposed after freedom. It surrounds you with protection so that what once held you does not regain access. Psalm 18 also addresses the issue of endurance. Freedom is tested over time. Initial release is emotional and dramatic, but long-term freedom is quiet, disciplined, and intentional. David speaks of being kept from sin, not because he was incapable of failure, but because God sustained him. This teaches that sustained freedom is relational. It is maintained through connection, awareness, and humility. There is also a sobering reality revealed in this psalm. When God breaks chains, opposition often intensifies briefly before it collapses completely. David speaks of enemies who cried out but found no deliverance because they were resisting divine judgment. This shows that when God intervenes, resistance may surface. This is not a sign of failure. It is confirmation that something irreversible has begun. The shaking increases just before structures fall. God's voice also redefines power. David does not describe power as domination, but as stability. He says God made his way blameless and secure. Power is not loud aggression, it is unshakable grounding. Chains thrive in instability. When your emotions are volatile, when your identity is uncertain, when your direction is unclear, chains find attachment points. God's voice stabilizes the inner life so that nothing external can attach itself long enough to bind you again. Psalm 18 further reveals that deliverance brings accountability. David speaks openly about walking in God's ways and not turning aside. Freedom comes with responsibility. Once chains break, excuses lose legitimacy. God empowers you to choose differently. This is not pressure, it is dignity. God treats you as capable, trusted, and responsible. Chains treat you as powerless. Freedom restores agency. There is also a generational dimension in Psalm 18. David's deliverance was not only for himself, it shaped the future of a nation. Chains rarely affect only one person. They ripple outward through families, relationships, and generations. When God breaks chains, he is interrupting cycles that would otherwise continue. Your freedom matters beyond you. It changes what others will inherit. Psalm 18 emphasizes that God's ways are perfect and his word is flawless. This is not abstract theology, it is lived reality. David learned that trusting God's voice, even when circumstances contradict it, is the foundation of lasting freedom. Chains often persist because people trust what they see more than what God says. Psalm 18 calls for a reversal of that order. God's word defines reality, not the other way around. Another important truth is that freedom includes discernment. David describes how God illuminated darkness. Darkness is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply unknown. Chains thrive in what is unexamined. God's voice reveals motives, patterns, and attachments that were previously hidden. This revelation can be uncomfortable, but it is necessary. You cannot dismantle what you refuse to see. Psalm 18 also confronts the fear of loss that often accompanies deliverance. Some chains feel like identity. Letting go feels like dying. God's voice reassures by replacing loss with restoration. David did not lose himself in freedom, he found himself. What fell away were distortions, not essentials. God does not remove what you need, he removes what limits you. As David praises God at the end of this psalm, it is not performative worship, it is acknowledgement. Praise anchors freedom. It reminds the soul where power truly comes from. Praise prevents pride and despair alike. It keeps the heart aligned with truth. If you feel that God is expanding your life right now, even if it feels uncomfortable or uncertain, Psalm 18 invites you to trust the process. Expansion often feels like exposure before it feels like freedom. God is not dismantling your life to harm you. He is removing what cannot survive where He is taking you. And if this message is helping you see God's purpose more clearly, strengthening your faith, and encouraging you to walk forward without fear, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more teachings that reveal how God's voice brings freedom, clarity, and lasting transformation. Psalm 18 reaches its culmination not in noise, but in certainty. After the shaking, after the fire, after the rescue, after the pursuit, after the breaking of chains, David arrives at a place of deep, immovable assurance. This is one of the most important dimensions of true deliverance. When freedom settles into the soul and becomes identity, not just experience. God does not break chains so that you live in constant anticipation of the next battle. He breaks chains so that you learn how to stand in peace, strength, and unshakable trust. One of the most powerful truths in Psalm 18 is that God's voice does not merely interrupt danger, it establishes order. Chaos is not only external turmoil. Chaos is internal instability, emotional fragmentation, and spiritual disorientation. Chains thrive in chaos because confusion weakens resistance. When God speaks, He does not just silence enemies, He reorganizes the inner world of the one He delivers. This is why David's tone at the end of Psalm 18 is calm, confident, and grounded. The storm has passed, but more importantly, the soul has been stabilized. David repeatedly refers to God as his rock. A rock is not dramatic. It does not move. It does not react. It does not panic. This imagery matters deeply. After deliverance, many people remain emotionally volatile. They are free, but still bracing for impact. Psalm 18 teaches that true freedom produces steadiness. When God becomes your rock, your sense of safety no longer depends on circumstances. Chains lose their power because fear no longer governs your reactions. Another profound layer of Psalm 18 is the restoration of trust. Chains damage trust more than anything else. They teach the soul that relief is unreliable, that hope is dangerous, that expectation leads to pain. God's voice restores trust gradually but deeply. David does not merely celebrate rescue. He proclaims confidence in God's future faithfulness. This is crucial. Freedom is not proven by what you escaped, but by what you now expect without fear. Psalm 18 also reveals that deliverance reshapes memory. David recounts his suffering, but it no longer defines him. Memory without healing becomes a chain. It replays trauma, reinforces fear, and limits growth. Memory with God becomes testimony. It no longer traps you in the past. It anchors you in gratitude. God does not erase memory, but He redeems it. The pain becomes proof of His faithfulness rather than evidence of abandonment. There is also a deep spiritual maturity revealed here. David does not deny future battles. He acknowledges that opposition will exist, but his posture has changed. He no longer sees himself as vulnerable prey. He sees himself as protected, guided, and upheld. Chains often return when people believe freedom is fragile. Psalm 18 teaches that freedom rooted in God is resilient. It does not collapse at the first sign of pressure. Another essential truth is that God's voice produces clarity of allegiance. David openly declares his loyalty to the Lord. Deliverance clarifies who you serve. When chains break, divided loyalties become unsustainable. Fear cannot share authority with faith. Self-reliance cannot coexist with trust in God. Psalm 18 shows that freedom requires a singular center. God does not compete with chains. He replaces them. Psalm 18 also addresses a subtle but dangerous threat: complacency. After freedom, there is a temptation to relax spiritually, to assume that vigilance is no longer necessary. David does not fall into this trap. He remains aware, grounded, and connected to God. This is not anxiety, it is wisdom. Freedom is protected by awareness, not fear. Chains return most often when people forget how dependent they are on God. Another powerful aspect of this psalm is how it reframes strength. Strength is not domination, aggression, or emotional hardness. Strength is endurance, discernment, and faithfulness. David's strength comes from God's gentleness. This is a striking phrase. Gentleness is not weakness, it is controlled power. Chains often form in harshness, self-criticism, bitterness, resentment. God's gentleness heals these internal fractures and replaces them with quiet strength. Psalm 18 also teaches that freedom restores joy, not superficial happiness, but deep satisfaction. David's praise is not forced, it flows naturally from peace. Joy is a sign that chains have truly broken. Fear cannot coexist with joy. Anxiety cannot thrive where trust has settled. Joy does not mean the absence of challenges, it means the presence of confidence. There is also a communal dimension to freedom. David's deliverance affected nations, relationships, and influence. God's work in your life is never isolated. When chains break, others benefit. Your peace changes how you speak. Your stability changes how you lead. Your faith changes what others believe is possible. Freedom multiplies. Psalm 18 ends with honor directed entirely toward God. This is not humility as performance, it is alignment. David understands that taking credit would eventually lead to bondage again. Pride rebuilds chains. Gratitude dismantles them. By keeping God at the center, David protects his freedom. If you are at a stage where the storm has quieted, but you are still learning how to trust the calm, Psalm 18 speaks directly to you. God is not finished with you. He is teaching you how to live free, not just how to escape. Freedom is not a moment. It is a way of being. The voice of the Lord still shakes what must fall. It still breaks what binds, and it still establishes what will last. What God has freed you from will not reclaim you, because His word is stronger than any chain. If this series has strengthened your faith, brought clarity to your struggles, and reminded you of the power of God's word, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more teachings that reveal how God speaks, delivers, and establishes His people in lasting freedom. Psalm 18 opens a final and deeper layer of understanding about freedom that many people only realize after the noise has faded and the dust has settled. This layer is not about rescue, nor about victory, nor even about restoration. It is about transformation of consciousness. When God's voice breaks chains, it does not merely change circumstances. It permanently alters how the soul relates to reality, to time, and to God Himself. This is where freedom becomes irreversible. One of the most dangerous misconceptions about deliverance is the belief that once chains are broken, life should return to normal. Psalm 18 reveals the opposite. There is no return to normal after God speaks. There is only transition into a new order of living. David does not go back to who he was before the crisis. He becomes someone else. Chains did not just restrict him, they shaped him. And once they were broken, what emerged was not the old self restored, but a refined self revealed. This is crucial. Many people unconsciously try to rebuild their old identity after deliverance because it feels familiar. Familiarity feels safe, even when it was painful. Psalm 18 confronts this instinct. David does not cling to old patterns, old fears, or old definitions of himself. He allows God's voice to redefine him completely. This is why his confidence is not rooted in memory of pain, but in certainty of God. Another essential truth revealed here is that God's voice establishes internal authority. Before chains break, external forces dictate behavior. Circumstances decide mood, people decide worth, fear decides direction. After God speaks, that hierarchy collapses. David no longer reacts to threats. He responds from alignment. This is the highest form of freedom. You are no longer controlled by what happens to you, but anchored in who God is to you. Psalm 18 shows that this internal authority is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not need validation. It is quiet, stable, and immovable. David's later life reflects this. Even when challenges arise, they do not destabilize him the way earlier trials did. This does not mean he no longer feels pain. It means pain no longer governs him. Chains lose their power when pain loses authority. Another profound aspect of this stage of freedom is discernment. Psalm 18 shows that after deliverance, David clearly distinguishes between what deserves his energy and what does not. Chains often drain energy because they force constant reaction. After God speaks, reaction is replaced with intention. This is not emotional numbness, it is spiritual clarity. You stop fighting battles that are not yours. You stop proving yourself to people who cannot understand you. You stop chasing approval that was never meant to sustain you. Psalm 18 also reveals that freedom changes how you experience time. When bound, time feels heavy. The past dominates the present. The future feels threatening. After God speaks, time realigns. The past becomes testimony, not prison. The present becomes purposeful, not overwhelming. The future becomes promise, not fear. This temporal healing is often overlooked, but it is essential. Many people remain bound not by circumstances, but by time, by what was, by what might be. God's voice restores you to the present with confidence. There is also a deep relational shift that occurs after chains break. David no longer seeks validation from those who once rejected him. Psalm 18 shows that deliverance clarifies belonging. You stop forcing connection. You stop begging for recognition. You stop shrinking to fit spaces that cannot hold who you have become. God's voice settles the question of worth so completely that external affirmation becomes secondary. Another key truth is that freedom requires stewardship. Psalm 18 does not present freedom as entitlement. It presents it as trust. God entrusts David with influence, stability, and authority because David understands where it came from. Freedom that forgets its source becomes fragile. Freedom that remembers God becomes resilient. This is why David remains grounded in praise. Praise is not ritual, it is remembrance. Psalm 18 also dismantles the fear of future failure. Many people live cautiously after deliverance, afraid that one mistake will undo everything. This fear is itself a chain. God's voice does not free you into constant anxiety. It frees you into grace-filled responsibility. David does not walk perfectly, but he walks confidently. He trusts God's correction as much as God's protection. This trust is a sign of maturity. Another often ignored dimension of freedom is solitude. After deliverance, God often leads people into quieter seasons. This is not abandonment, it is integration. The soul needs space to adjust to freedom. Psalm 18 reflects this internal quiet. The battle language fades, and assurance takes its place. Silence after deliverance is not emptiness. It is stability settling in. Psalm 18 ultimately reveals that the greatest chain God breaks is not external opposition, but internal separation from Him. All other chains are symptoms. When God's voice restores intimacy, everything else realigns. Fear loses relevance, shame loses credibility, control loses necessity. The soul rests. This resting does not produce passivity, it produces clarity. You move without urgency. You speak without desperation. You decide without panic. This is what Psalm 18 points toward. Not a life without challenges, but a life without bondage. If you are sensing a shift where struggle is giving way to stability, where striving is being replaced by trust, where noise is giving way to clarity, Psalm 18 is confirming that God's work in you is entering its deepest phase. He is not just freeing you, He is establishing you, and if this message continues to strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding of God's voice, and anchor you in lasting freedom, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more teachings that reveal how God transforms, stabilizes, and establishes those He delivers. Psalm 18 ultimately brings us to the most mature and enduring expression of freedom, a life that is no longer organized around escape from bondage, but around communion with God. At this stage, chains are no longer the central concern, not because danger has vanished, but because intimacy has displaced fear. This is where the voice of the Lord no longer only interrupts crises, but continually orders the soul. Freedom becomes sustained alignment rather than repeated rescue. One of the clearest signs of this level of freedom is that God's presence becomes more compelling than God's intervention. Earlier stages of deliverance focus on what God does. This stage focuses on who God is. David no longer speaks primarily about enemies or threats. He speaks about the Lord living, the Lord being exalted, the Lord being his rock forever. When God becomes the center rather than the solution, chains lose their relevance. They no longer define seasons or determine direction. Psalm 18 reveals that the voice of the Lord creates a life that is no longer reaction-based. Before freedom, much of life is reactive. Pain determines mood. Fear determines decisions. Opposition determines pace. After God's voice establishes the soul, reaction gives way to response. This is a subtle but profound shift. Reaction is unconscious and defensive. Response is intentional and grounded. Chains depend on reaction. When reaction disappears, chains cannot attach. Another deep transformation revealed here is emotional authority. David is no longer emotionally governed by what surrounds him. This does not mean emotional suppression. It means emotional clarity. Feelings are acknowledged, but they no longer rule. This is one of the most powerful forms of freedom. Many people remain bound not by circumstances, but by unmanaged emotional currents. God's voice does not silence emotion, it orders it. Psalm 18 also reveals that freedom matures into wisdom. David's language becomes measured, reflective, and discerning. He understands that not every battle requires engagement. Not every threat deserves attention. Not every voice deserves response. Chains often persist because people feel obligated to address everything. Wisdom releases you from unnecessary struggle. God's voice trains discernment so that energy is invested where it produces life, not exhaustion. At this stage, faith is no longer dependent on outcomes. This is crucial. Earlier, faith may have been fueled by visible rescue. Now it is sustained by trust in God's character. Even when circumstances are unclear, confidence remains intact. This is unshakable faith. Chains lose power when faith no longer needs constant reassurance. God's voice has already settled the matter of loyalty and trust. Psalm 18 also shows that this level of freedom brings humility without insecurity. David honors God openly without self-erasure. He acknowledges his calling, his authority, and his influence, but always in reference to God. This balance is essential. Insecurity creates chains of comparison. Pride creates chains of isolation. Humility rooted in truth creates freedom. God's voice establishes this balance. Another important truth here is that freedom reshapes desire. What once felt urgent no longer dominates. Approval, recognition, and validation lose intensity. Desire becomes aligned with purpose rather than compensation. Many chains are formed because unmet desires seek fulfillment in unhealthy ways. When God's voice realigns desire, those chains dissolve naturally. Psalm 18 also reveals that true freedom produces stability in leadership. David's influence expands, not because he strives for control, but because he embodies security. People are drawn to stability. God establishes leaders by stabilizing their inner life. Chains often break so that others can be guided safely. Your freedom is not only for you, it creates safety for those connected to you. Another often overlooked aspect of this psalm is how deliverance matures into responsibility. David understands that freedom does not exempt him from accountability. It increases it. God trusts him with greater influence because he understands dependence. This paradox is central to lasting freedom. The more authority you carry, the more grounded you must remain. Psalm 18 also addresses the fear of regression. Many people worry that freedom is temporary, that one failure will undo everything. David's confidence counters this fear. He knows that God's covenant is stronger than his weakness. This does not produce recklessness, it produces peace. Fear of failure is itself a chain. God's voice replaces it with trust in grace. Another defining feature of this stage is gratitude as posture, not reaction. David's praise is not conditional, it is continuous. Gratitude becomes the environment of the soul. This environment is inhospitable to chains. Bitterness cannot survive there. Resentment cannot grow there. Fear cannot take root there. Psalm 18 ultimately shows that the highest freedom is not independence, but dependence rightly placed. David depends fully on God and is therefore free from everything else. This reverses human logic. Dependence on unstable things creates bondage. Dependence on God creates freedom. When God's voice becomes your reference point, nothing else can enslave you. If you have reached a place where struggle has softened into awareness, where urgency has given way to clarity, and where faith feels steady rather than desperate, Psalm 18 is confirming that God has not only delivered you, but established you. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of living free without fear of returning to bondage. The voice of the Lord still speaks. It still orders chaos. It still breaks what binds, and it still establishes those who listen in strength, peace, and purpose. If this teaching series has helped you understand Scripture more deeply, strengthened your faith, and guided you toward lasting freedom, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for more messages that reveal the power, depth, and transforming voice of the Lord.